Welcome back to PowerPoint 365. This is your host, Star Codes. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm going to pray very quickly. Everyone with me, bow your heads, please. Dear Father God, thank you for this day. Thank you for every day. Thank you for allowing us to come together. Thank you for giving us this time to spend some time to study. I ask that you give us the eyes, the ears, and the heart to receive this message. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. Just very briefly before we get started with the article, first we're going to have a look at video. I found this very interesting that this gentleman was stating that he was being forced to call himself white when he claimed himself to be a black Egyptian. And he said when he came here to the States, he was being forced, and even on his job, he was having a hard time with the people on his job. So we're going to hear what this teacher has to say just for a brief moment.
My father is much darker than I am. My mother is lighter than I am. In Egypt, people are identified by the religion first, not the race. So in Egypt, if you are Christian, you are a minority person. But if you're black, you're not a minority person. You are a part of the mainstream society. And I came from this background. And in Egypt, you identify as Arab and as Muslim. And in this country, when I first came, I identified myself as Arab American and Muslim first. And gradually, I became to identify myself as black. I came to the U.S. in 1978, and I became U.S. citizen in 1985. When I became a U.S. resident, I was told by the Immigration and Naturalization that I am white. And I told them that I'm black, and they said, no, in this country, you are white. All Arabs in this country, all Arab immigrants are white. I didn't pay much attention in the beginning to this, because in the Arab world, we identify with our ethnicity first as Arabs, and then with the race second as black or white or whatever. But in this country, you identify with your racial group first and then with your ethnicity second. Gradually, I became black first and Arab second. And I rejected my white classification publicly for the first time in 1987, in February, as a panelist in a function sponsored by the Association of the Study of Black Life and History in Detroit. I said that I belong to two minority groups. I am Arab American and Black American, and I'm racially black and ethnically Egyptian. I was harassed by my employer right after that. I work for a white school district. The superintendent is white. All the associate superintendents are white, even though that we provide services to 30% black population. But the organization is white, and the approach is very white. The attitude towards me changed completely after I went out publicly and rejected my white classification. One coworker came to me and told me, a white coworker came to me and told me right after the function that he met with the superintendent, and if I don't keep my mouth shut, my educational career is over. He said, you have nothing to do with these people. You have a history and a culture. These people came from the jungle. You have nothing to do with them. These people lie and steal. When I see one of them in my neighborhood, I call the police. And I was told by the director of general education, who is retired now, in '88, I was told by him that I get people angry when I say that I'm black Egyptian. If I just say that I'm Egyptian, I would get along. I have to add that I was denied promotion twice because I chose black classification. This is part of my 2 lawsuits against my employer, which are currently pending. 2 lawsuits.
Now, just for the education of our viewership, why don't you share with us a breakdown of Egypt as it is today, insofar as blacks or combinations thereof of European descent and what have you?
We don't have Egyptians of European descent in Egypt. We have a population which is basically a mixture of ancient Egyptian blacks who intermarried with Arabs right after the Arab conquest. The ancient Egyptian population was brown and black before the Arab conquest. But before the Arab conquest came the Greeks. The ancient Egyptian population was in Egypt for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptian population was brown and black. And the Greeks came in 300 BC. and they started to intermarry with the local population, and then the Romans came and ruled from 70 BC until they were conquered by the Arabs and kicked out by the Arabs in the 7th century. And these people intermarried with the Egyptian Copts, and they made the pigmentation of the Egyptians, the Copts, much lighter because of this intermarriage with Europeans.
Now, you're an educator, okay? Now, how do you deal with situations when you practice your profession insofar as dealing with the mythology or the misconceptions about Egypt being a white civilization? How do you deal with that?
This is a big problem because Egypt, the ancient Egyptian civilization was a black civilization, and ancient Egyptians were black according to the Greek scholars and the Roman scholars. Ancient Egypt became white only in the 19th century and in the 20th century. And the scholar who is responsible for this is Seligman, the noted anthropologist from England, Seligman. White supremacy argues that blacks are inferior than white intellectually. They are subhuman and they are incapable of building a civilization. White supremacy had one dilemma until Seligman came. The dilemma was ancient Egypt was black according to the Greek and the Roman scholars. 10 of them said that, including Aristotle and Plato. 10 of them said that in writing. They had this dilemma. Ancient Egyptian was black. So if blacks are inferior intellectually and are incapable of building a civilization, how come the ancient Egyptians built a civilization? Seligman found the solution for this dilemma. He came up with a theory called the Hamite theory. He separated the blacks who built a civilization in Egypt and Ethiopia from the rest of the black race, and he called them brown-skinned whites, or the Hamites. So Seligman saved white supremacy from this dilemma, and all the white scholars followed him from that time on. This was at the end of the 19th century. And since that time, white scholarship says that ancient Egypt is white.
Mustafa Hefni is currently working on his doctorate degree at Wayne State University. His dissertation topic is a content analysis of the treatment of ancient Egypt in world history textbooks. And just how far is this determined Egyptian willing to go to be classified black?
I want to carry my case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court if necessary.
Okay. So right quick, I'm going to be coming from Genesis 10 and 32. Again, that's Genesis 10 and 32. These are the families of the sons of Noah after their generations in their nations, and by these were the nations divided in the earth after the flood. So today I'm going to be reading you guys an article, and this is from the Statesman, Denver, Colorado, and it's called The Descendants of Ham. And I was very moved by this when I first read it. And it's by G.O.W. Coffee, Dr. G.O.W. Coffee. And this was published in their newspaper, I guess, October 7th, 1905. So this is a 1905 paper. Okay. And you guys know I like old things anyway, so this one right here really moved me, and I was really glad when I found it. So once again, this is called The Descendants of Ham, and this is a paper read before the Literary Society. It reads, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, in choosing this subject it is not my purpose to merely give a narrative of what the Negro race has accomplished in a very short period of time, but rather to prove that the Negro has an ancestry and history to which it may refer with such pride, and of which it may be justly proud. All races except the Negro race consider it a great honor to trace their ancestry back to ancient times. It has been said, and it is still being said, that the Negroes have the ancestors, and we ourselves are ever bemoaning and lamenting the fact that we are descendants of Ham, upon one of whose sons a curse was pronounced. A more serious and erroneous mistake could not be made. The sons of Ham were as follows: Mizraim, Cush, Put, and Canaan. Remember, the curse was pronounced upon Canaan, the youngest son of Ham, and not upon Mizraim, Cush, and Put. Another important thing we must remember is that it is commonly said that God pronounced the curse upon Canaan. Such is not true. It was Noah himself who pronounced the curse upon Canaan. In Genesis 9:24 and 25 verses, we find these words: "And Noah woke from his wine, and knew what his younger son had done unto him. And he said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall be unto his brethren." Thus, you see, the curse was pronounced upon Canaan only. Regardless of this fact, however, Canaan and his descendants became a great people and mighty rulers. Canaan and his descendants peopled Palestine, and they ruled this country for hundreds of years. When the promise was made to Abraham, the descendants of Canaan were in Palestine. When Israel came up out of Egypt 400 years later, they were still in possession of it. And even after the Israelites had entered upon their promised possessions, two tribes, the Jebusites and the Sidonians, resisted them 400 years. Not until David became king were the Jebusites driven out, as he did not succeed in driving out the Sidonians. The Phoenicians, the founders of Carthage, were descendants of Canaan. Ancient history proves this fact, and since we know it is characteristics of Caucasians to try to deprive the Negroes of everything that is honorable and condemnable, let us quote from Roland, one of the earliest historians. He says, "The Canaanites are the same people who are called almost always Phoenicians by the Greeks." Dr. Barnes also says that the Phoenicians are descendants of the Canaanites in his commentaries on Matt, and then it says 1522. He says of this, that the woman who met Jesus on the coast of Tyre of Sidon, this woman is also called a Greek, a Syro-Phoenician by birth. On the same text, Dr. Abbott also said the term Canaanite was the older title of the country, and the inhabitants were successively termed Canaanites and Phoenicians, as the inhabitants of England were successively called Britons and Englishmen. All students of history were well aware of what the Carthaginians, the direct descendants of Canaan. Now, I am going to put up some coin imagery, because we do remember Hannibal. He is from Carthage as well. He has some siblings as well. And on these coins, he looks very African looking to me. So he does have very black features. And matter of fact, they just came out with a show and they casted him as a black man, and people just like almost lost their mind. And it was because they might have been ignorant of some facts. So whom was once one color, they're now another color. And now people are coming out and saying, especially university students, they're like, you can't do that because we got taught something else. So now they're trying to go back and revisit history and say, oh, we're sorry, we made mistakes. But, it doesn't work like that. Anyway, what did the world in the way of art, science... Oh, let me back up. I'm sorry, you guys. All students of the history are well aware of what Carthaginians, the direct descendants of Canaan, did for the world in the way of art, science, and literature. And speaking of Carthaginian government, Roland says, the government of the Carthage was founded upon principle and most consummate wisdom. And it is with reason that artistal ranks of this republic in the number of those that were held, scroll down, in the great esteem by ancients, and which were fit to serve as a model for others. What race would not be proud of such ancestry as that of the descendants of Canaan? So great is such an ancestry that the blue-eyed Anglo-Saxon has tried to rob the Negro race of any claim to it whatever. Let us now return our attention to the direct ancestors of the Negro race. It is a historical fact that Egyptian and Ethiopian were people contemporaneously by Mizraim and Cush, the two older sons of Ham. And these two countries for a long time were confederate under one government, being a similar people in politics and literature. One of the first and most eminent historians has proves beyond any reasonable doubt that Egypt and Ethiopia were the first among the early monarchies, and that an ancestor of the Negro race was one of the first of the earth's greatest monarchs. Roland speaking, the son of Ham, says Cush settled in Ethiopia and Mizraim in Egypt. Both the Holy Scriptures, the discoveries of science, and ancient history show the conclusive evidence that the ancient Egyptians were black. The book of Psalms continually speaks of Egypt as being in the land of Ham. Here are a few verses from the book Psalm. And he smote all of the firstborn in Egypt, the chief of their strength in the tabernacles of Ham. Psalm 78:51. Israel also came into Egypt, and Jacob sojourned with the land of Ham. Psalm 105:23. He sent Moses, his servant, and Aaron, whom he had chosen. They showed his signs among them and wonders in the land of Ham. Psalms 105:26 and 27. They forgot God, their Savior, which had a great things in Egypt, wondrous works in the land of Ham. Psalms 106:21 and 22 as a further evidence that the ancient Egyptians were black and were Negroes. Let us quote from Herodotus. This writer traveled extensively through Egypt and was therefore well acquainted for his own observations with the appearance of the people. Speaking of Egyptians, he used the following words: black in complexion and woolly haired. I'm going to go down, you guys. Black with projecting lips. That the ancient Ethiopians were also Negroes. The most eminent historians agree. And we also have scripture querying concerning them. Can the Ethiopian change his skin? Solomon, the wise man, married a Negro woman, having married the daughter of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Sufficient evidence being given to shows that the ancient Egyptians and the Ethiopians were Negroes. Let us now review their intellectual capabilities according to the history of Africa. was one of the time the nursery of science and literature. It was from the point that science and literature were this. Hold on, let me see. I gotta go down here. I'm sorry. Disseminated among the Greeks and Romans. Solomon, Plato, Pythagoreans, and many other learned men of ancient Greece made many trips into Africa in search of knowledge. History proves that the Greeks represented Minerva, their favorite goddess of wisdom, as an African princess. I'm going to go down. Multitude of the people flocked from all parts of the world to receive instruction from the African Elucid, who was just 300 years before Christ at the head of the most celebrated mathematical institution of the world. Africa has been termed the cradle of ancient church, and we all know it was the asylum, so to speak, the first infant savior. For it was into Egypt that Joseph fled with the child Jesus and his mother to escape Herod, king of Judea. Matthew 2:13 through 15. Some of the most noted fathers and writers of the primitive church were Africans. Among them were such men of origin: Tertullus, Augustine, Clemens, Alexandrius, Cyril. How dare then anyone say that Africa is without her her Aldry of science, of fame, and of the Negro race has no ancestry and no history, or which it may refer with a sense of humor. History also proves that the whole race of Africa sprang from the Egyptians and Ethiopians, and everybody certainly does not know that the Negro of the North America, Central America, South America descended originally from the African tribes. Now the question is, what have the Negroes of the Americas accomplished? I'm going to go down. How they done anything that is promise-worthy or deserves favorable comment? The answer is yes. During the antebellum days, the white people of America said that the Negroes were stupid, immoral, degenerate, and not capable of attending unto a high standard of civilization. And the same is said by the whites of today. Just what the white people have said about the Negroes, the Romans said about the Britons. Both Cicero and Caesar said that the Britons were so stupid and uncivilized that they were not fit to be Roman slaves. As proof of such, I will give you 2 or 3 of their statements. Cicero, writing to his friend Atticus, has said, has this to say: the ugliest and most stupid slaves in Rome came from Britain. Do not buy slaves from Britain on account of their stupidity and their inaptitude to learn music and other accomplishments. Caesar, speaking of the Britons, saying, in their domestic and social habits, the Britons are degraded, as most savage nations. Dr. Phillips has also to say about Cicero concerning the Britons. Seated one day in the house of the friend of Cape Town, in the bust of Cicero in my right hand, and one of Sir Isaac Newton on the left, I accidentally opened a book of the table at that passage in Cicero's letter to Atticus, in which the philosopher speaks so contemporarily of the natives of the Great Britain. Now this part that, he's going on and on about the about what he said. struck curious coin, confidence. I'm going to skip down. Sharp rising. Okay, the descendants of Britain, century Rome, refuted everything that the Romans said about them and became the dominant race of the world. So, have the Negroes refuted what the white people of America have said concerning them, and they will in time become the dominant race of the world. Those who are less optimistic than myself think such is impossible. So, thought the Romans of the Britons. The professor of ancient history in Yale University, startled by the whole American continent 6 years ago when he said that the Negro race would in time become, hold on, I gotta go up, you guys, the dominant race of America. This stands to reason when all things are taken into consideration. It is an acknowledged fact that the American Negroes have done more and have accomplished more in 40 years than any other race in the world. A race that can produce such men as Toussaint, I don't want to say the name incorrectly, Lo-o-Virtue, Banneker, Crispus, Atticus, Frederick Douglass, which he said Fred Douglass here, Bishop Allen, B.T. Washington, Scarborough, Du Bois, Bowen, Kelly, Miller, and hundreds of others that could be mentioned as a fair chance of taking the first place among the races of the world. But you may say that they are exceptions. And true, this may be. So it is with all races, the men who are most conspicuous in the public eye and who are the most spoken of and pointed as the beacon of lights of any race are exceptions. Bismarck, who exerted all his energies toward the unafflictions of Germany. So I'm going to go over a little bit. Was an exception. Gladstone, who strived long and hard for the conversion of England from the feudal to a democratic commonwealth, was an exception. George Washington, the father of this country, was an exception. Lincoln, who gave his life for the maintenance of the Union and the abolition of slavery, was an exception. President Roosevelt, the father of a square deal and the open door policy, is an exception. The Negro can do anything that the white man can do. Educationally, he has reduced his literacy 45%. He has written more than 500 books. There are in the United States at least 30,000 Negroes teachers, 2,000 lawyers, and more than 2,000 doctors, 180 inventors, 400 Negro newspapers. He has furnished a thoroughly equipped man to fill any chair of learning in the universities of the United States. The accumulations made by the Negro and the wealth of property since the emancipation is marvelous. I give you some of the figures taken from the 20th century Negro literature by own. They own banks, magazines, newspapers, values of liberty, libraries, drug stores, schools, property, churches, farms, personal property. Now, some of these numbers go from, they look like up to, that's going past 20,000, 400. So they're going into like the millions. And then you have other numbers where the numbers are going past 100,000s. Anyway, with such a showing, this is the race should be really encouraged. Individuals may lose hope, but the race will never will. Before closing, I desire to impress one thing upon your minds. Nowhere in the news, in this paper, have I encouraged a Negro immigration to Africa, for I am bitterly opposed to it. The Negro is an American citizen. He is an integral part of the American nation. This is his country. He belongs here, and he will stay. Just a word concerning those who are trying to get away from the race, who are trying to shield their identity with the descendants of Ham. In other words, trying to be white. I ask anyone in the audience to point out the name or name one person of that class who has ever amounted to anything, who has ever done anything, or who is doing anything for the good of his race or any other race. The white people do not care to be identified with such persons, but they do laugh and sneer at them for being so small, narrow-minded, and ignorant. It is just as impossible for those would-be race settlers to mingle with the decent classes of white people as it is for the Mississippi River to change its course. Such persons are dupes, sneaks, caves, and disgrace to the Negro race. I would give the advice: be yourself, be real, be what you will or may, but first of all, be yourself. The world will like you better for it. In closing this paper, it says, I know of no words more appropriate than of the following poem. Now he gives a poem. I'm not going to read that part, but I just wanted to read that to the class because I figured, at any point in time, and we know with everything going on and people waking up and saying, this is who I am, or this is who I believe I am, or God showed me a dream vision, or, or led me to someone who could tell me who I am. This one right here, it's like really puts a nail in the a hammer to the nail, because here we are, now saying what we're saying, and they were saying this over 100 years ago, that no, this is who these people are. And now here we see today with all these racial groups being changed. Also, very briefly, before we fully end out those of us that are here, we're going to elaborate a little bit on some other things before we go. But anyway, before then, because I know those of you that are listening, thank you for tuning in, and I hope this was helpful and even educational to those of you, especially those that may feel that I was about to say the Negro and saying Negro so much, right? That the black person, or okay, Negro's not bad for us to say, because folks know Negro land and all that stuff. Anyway, the average black person does not realize and know that they do have a rich history. So we get those 2 or 3 book pages, in our history books, and it's always depicting us as just a slave and all that stuff, and we're more than that. So I hope that this whole video was educational to you and helpful. So thank you all for tuning in to Power Panel 365.